You guys, The Legend of Zelda is probably my favorite series of... No, it's not probably. Not probably. It is my favorite series of games. It's turning 35 years old this year. And so, to honor that, Nintendo is doing what they did 10 years ago to celebrate the 25th anniversary, releasing Skyward Sword. So yeah. Anyways, I wanted to celebrate the 35th anniversary by putting in as much effort as Nintendo is to celebrate. The bare minimum. So we're gonna do a tier ranking again, okay? All of the mainline Zelda games, all 19 mainline Zelda games, any that have been remade, I'm counting the remakes in with the original so that we don't end up with this list of... What I'm trying to say is just the main 19 games, that's what I'm ranking, okay? And I got a comment last time that my preamble before was too long, so let's just get to it. The tiers. At the top here, we've got the Golden Master Sword. No, you know what? Let's go from the bottom up. At the bottom here, we've got NA. There's only one game that's going to end up there. We'll get to it. Just above that, that's a Giant's Knife. It's a waste of 200 rupees, right? Like, just a waste of money. It may look like the fantastic other Zelda games, but realistically, it's going to break after 8 hits. Basically, crap. Just above that, we've got the Goddess Sword. These are going to be games that are pretty solid, but have something annoying living inside of them. Top of that, we've got the Magical Sword from the original Legend of Zelda. These are good games. These are like great Zelda games. Any other series, these would be top tier games, but in the Legend of Zelda series, they're just a cut below the sort of more iconic, really solid games. That's going to be the Master Sword tier. These are the iconic games that definitely manage to encapsulate what makes Zelda great, but they don't reach the full potential of the series. That's going to be the top tier, the Golden Master Sword. The sword that has been tempered at least once by dwarves and again by a fat fairy. So, top tier. Okay, let's get into this. I'm gonna do this in chronological order for the time that the games were released. I've actually put together this tier. I'll share the link to it. You should at me on Twitter with your tier ranking. I would love to see it. Anyways, let's get into the original Legend of Zelda. Now, the story for the original Legend of Zelda, the backstory, basically, Link was out and about one day, and he saw this old lady named Impa being attacked by a bunch of bad guys. And so Link saved her, and she's like, "Hey, thanks for saving me. Since you was up, do you think you could just maybe get the 8 shards of the Triforce of Wisdom that Zelda broke apart? Because, oh yeah, she's also captured by Ganon. So maybe while you're out getting those eight shards, maybe you could just bop on over to the Death Mountain and kill the Prince of Darkness for me. That would be great." And Link's like, "Yeah, okay." Very simplistic game. That backstory, by the way, is all within the manual, because nobody's got time for stories in NES games. This game had all of the major elements there that make a great Zelda game. Interesting combat, a fun overworld to explore, items that help you progress, puzzles. If you count pushing a block a puzzle, they're also there. I love this game, love going back to it. It's an NES game, so obviously maybe it hasn't aged as well as some other games, but I still think it's a solid game. I'm putting it in the Master Sword tier. Probably would make more sense to put it in the Magical Sword tier, because that sword's actually in that. But it's going where it's going. Okay, the next game is going to be Zelda 2. In this story, Link's a couple years older, and Impa's like, "Hey, thanks for saving Zelda, great job. Also, there's this other Zelda that's been asleep for like 100 years. You should probably wake her up by getting some crystals or some shit. Also, just a heads up, there are minions of Ganon, and they're gonna try to kill you to use your blood to resurrect him or some shit. I don't know. Don't die, because he's gonna be a real smug asshole about it if he gets resurrected." Okay. Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link is an interesting game in that it has elements... it's like they couldn't decide what they wanted to do. And so it's got all kinds of different elements. You've got the overhead travel, but then you've got side-scrolling action. There's XP thrown in there. Not all of it comes together well, but I cannot deny that I love this game despite its little annoyances. I'm putting it in the Goddess Sword tier here because I do still think it's worth playing. However, there are 2 caveats if you're going to play Zelda 2. Caveat number 1, play it with save states. This game punishes you pretty harshly if you die. You have to go all the way back to the beginning of the game, and if you're in the middle of traveling through Death Mountain, or you've gotten through Death Mountain, that fetching gauntlet, it can be a real downer if you die and you have to start all the way over. So use save states. There's no shame in it. The second stipulate the caveat is the word I use. The second caveat that I would name here is farm XP early in the game. There's bubbles that you can kill. They take like 100 hits, but they drop like 25 XP, and you can farm one in the first palace. Do that, level up, you'll have a great time. Of course, you're not playing the game in any way, shape, or form in the way that the developers originally intended, but still, makes it for an easier game. By the way, I'd like to see this remade with the kinks ironed out. Just saying. Okay, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. This is going to be our first Golden Master Sword tier game. This game is awesome. So the story here is, like, I don't know. This is like the basic template for every Zelda story that would come afterward. Okay, you've got, this is where you introduce like your first 3 introductory dungeons, and then there's a twist, and typically there's another world that gets introduced, and then you get the harder dungeons, and I don't know, the Master Sword's introduced here. All kinds of basic Zelda tropes are established here. And yet, it still has a lot of high fantasy elements in it that feel very much like a Tolkien book, which would make sense since Takeshi Tezuka, one of the main directors on this game, was a big fan of Tolkien. So yeah, I absolutely love A Link to the Past. It is absolutely iconic. Alright, so The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. This is a game that is very fascinating. Now, the story behind this is that there's some flying whale that's having a bad dream. Spoilers. Anyways, this is a great game. It started out just a bunch of programmers in Nintendo sort of programming a Zelda game on the Game Boy just kind of for kicks and giggles, and then it ultimately got approved and greenlit into becoming a full-fledged game. And it feels like a full Zelda experience on the original Game Boy, which is incredible when you think about how simplistic that original Game Boy was. The fact that this game gives you the same exact feelings that you get from a big Zelda game, but you could take it on the go, that cannot be underestimated. It's also got a quirky story, it's got fun side characters, and there are so many ways to experience this game. It's going in the Golden Master Sword tier, by the way. Personally, I get the most nostalgia by playing it on an original Game Boy, because my brother had this game on his big brick Game Boy, and that's how I remember originally playing it. But I would also recommend the remake. It's fantastic. We've got to pick up the pace here, guys. I could talk all day about Zelda. Ocarina of Time. We don't have to talk about this, do we? Okay. Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. So basically, at the end of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, what I like to think is that Link came on to Zelda, and Zelda felt like supremely awkward, and so she's like, no, I'm gonna send you back to when you were a kid so you can, I don't know, relive your childhood or some crap, I don't know. And so he gets sent back, and immediately Navi's like, okay, see you later, bitch, I'm out of here. I think I've earned myself a vacation. And that makes Link sad, so, you know, he goes looking for Navi and ends up in an alternate universe in which the moon is falling, and Link has to deal with existential threats and a whole lot of death, and just a lot of nightmare-inducing stuff. So real good call there, Zelda. Way to give him his childhood back. That's, really glad he got to live through all that. Oh, and as an added bonus in that timeline, you know, the split timeline that the Sage of Wisdom the split timeline that the holder of the Triforce Piece of Wisdom created, yeah, because she sent Link back, Ganon came back and took over Hyrule, and they had to flood it. Really earning that Triforce Piece of Wisdom there, Zelda. Okay, look, Majora's Mask is an interesting game. Did not like it at the time that it came out, but as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate all of the side quests and the quirky characters, and really the gameplay that's afforded by the different masks. It is such a good game, and I absolutely love it. Now, one thing probably should have talked about with Ocarina of Time, I would recommend the remake of Ocarina of Time on 3DS over the N64 version, despite the fact that obviously feel more nostalgic with the N64 version, but it is better on the 3DS. With Majora's Mask, it's like sixes. On the one hand, they've ironed out certain control issues, you know, like with aiming. They've changed a couple of the boss fights, and a couple of them are better, but some of them aren't, and I don't know. They made some improvements that were great in the 3DS remake, but then they nerfed Zora Link, and they changed up a bunch of stuff that really didn't need to be changed up. Not all of the changes work. Alright, so I'm starting to get a little bit worried here that I'm just going to end up throwing all of the Zelda games in the top 2 tiers, but when we talk about Oracle of Season and Oracle of Ages, these were games created by Capcom, not Nintendo. They were created for the Game Boy Color, and I can remember when they were coming out, I specifically, at the time, I had a subscription to Nintendo Power, and I specifically remember a piece long before these games came out, preview, that talked about how it was going to be a trilogy of games. And I'm going to look this up, but I swear I remember Link talking about there being like they were interviewing Link in the article, and he was talking about the Triforce, and he talks about how one of the pieces was eaten at some point. I'm gonna look into that after I finish editing this to see if that's true. Hey guys, this is Editing Josh. After further research, I can find no evidence of that magazine article. So I'm starting to think it's something that my mind just made up. But let me know in the comments if you guys remember an article that was like pretending to interview Link, and he talked about maybe a possible fourth piece of the Triforce being eaten at one point. What am I doing with my life? Anyways, getting back on point, each of the games was going to represent a specific piece of the Triforce. So Oracle of Seasons was either all about, well, it would have been all about power, the Triforce piece of power, because it's focused on combat and it's focused on action. Whereas Oracle of Ages has more of a focus on puzzle solving, and it represents the Triforce Piece of Wisdom. Personally, I prefer Oracle of Ages, but Oracle of Seasons isn't far behind. They are great, wonderful games that I would recommend playing, and if you're going to play them both, because they come together to make a full-fledged adventure. Ran out of steam on that one. Okay, The Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, Four Sword Adventures. This is the one that's going in the NA. We're going to talk about Four Sword Adventures. Four swords on this cart to me, felt like more of a proof of concept, so I don't think it's really fair to rate. Okay, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker is my favorite Zelda game. You can probably barely see my rug in the background here. My wife got me that rug for Christmas because she knows that that's my favorite Legend of Zelda game. It is certainly my favorite Link, because unlike every other Link that just gets to sit back and say, hey, look at me, I'm destined to save Hyrule, this Link's like, hey, look, my sister got kidnapped and I don't know what to do, but I gotta rescue her, and I don't give a shit, really, about whether you think I can or not. I'm gonna go do it. And he does. He literally forces the gods to choose him as a hero just so he can save his sister and then ultimately Zelda. For the goofiest looking Link, he's also the most badass, which is awesome to me. I love exploring the Great Sea. I love the story of Hyrule that has, been flooded and is under the waves. I love everything about this game. It doesn't have as many dungeons as it could have. They were cut in development. There are issues with the Triforce quest in the original game. However, if you play the HD remake, not only does it streamline the Triforce quest, it also gives you the Swift Cell, so you don't have to, you don't have to wake the winds, which kind of seems counter to the game's themes, but it is an improvement, so there you go. The Legend of Zelda Four Sword Adventures. We're finally putting something in the magical sword tier, guys. Okay, I was kind of afraid that I put too many tiers here. But Four Sword Adventures does a really admirable job of taking the gameplay of The Legend of Zelda and making it work in a multiplayer sphere. Problem is, playing this game now is a chore. You gotta have a GameCube, and you gotta have a whole bunch of Game Boy Advances and the link cables and everything. Unless you have a DSi that still has it downloaded on there because the DSi shop shut down. Or you had a 3DS and you got it for the single day that it was available. Listen to me, Nintendo. Don't you listen to anybody. I love how difficult you make it to play your old games. I love that about you. It is just, love it. Don't change. The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap. Great game. This is going in the Master Sword tier. I am discovering that I really like portable Zelda games. But Minish Cap does a great job of taking a lot of the personality that was in the Wind Waker and bringing it to a portable game. I like the whole relationship between the Minish, and I like the shifting, becoming small and becoming big, and the world changing accordingly. It's got a great story, some great dungeon design, and some great bosses. I love Minish Cap, but it's probably not on the same tier as Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, so I'm going to put it down in the Magical Sword tier, because I'm a little indecisive, and to prove that I'm a little indecisive, I'm putting it back in the Master Sword tier. So The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, we're putting Minish Cap back in the Magical Sword tier. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is... I don't know how to feel about this game, guys. It has some great dungeons. It really does. It's got a pretty decent story, and it's got character models that are... Yeah, there's some weird design choices made in this game. My biggest problem with Twilight Princess is it feels very much like Nintendo was trying to go for dark, but they didn't quite get there as organically as they did with Majora's Mask. And so sometimes Twilight Princess comes off as a teen who is really angsty and wears his angst on his sleeve, which is fitting because it was the first Zelda game that was rated T for teen. It's interesting. Hyrule Field bothers me because it's so big and vast and empty. That said, I do still enjoy this game quite a bit. I am going to stick that in the Master Sword tier, and I know that there are plenty of people who feel that Twilight Princess belongs in the upper tier, but I just don't think it reaches the same level as these gems. I just realized I completely gave up on telling the story of Zelda games. I mean, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Okay, The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass and The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. I don't like these games. I'm sorry. I don't like the DS games very much. My big problem with both of them, I'm not a huge fan, first of all, of the moving with the stylus, just because that's how you use your sword. But my big issue with both of the games are that they both feature dungeons that you have to come back to constantly throughout the game. I do like Phantom Hourglass's setting. You're still on the Great Sea and you're looking for a new Hyrule, and it's the same Link from the Wind Waker, so it kind of gets me there. And I do think that Phantom Hourglass has some decent ideas and some decent dungeons. I can play Phantom Hourglass and enjoy it ish. So I'm gonna stick it in the Magical Sword tier. Okay, Spirit Tracks is going in the Goddess Sword. I really do not like the whole overworld you're on a choo-choo, which is weird because I love Zelda and I love trains. Like, one of my big dreams is to make a model railroad in my basement, but it's kind of like ice cream and pizza. I don't want to throw ice cream on top of pizza despite the fact that I love both of them. Does that track? Does that make sense? Okay, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, depending on when I finally get this put up, it'll either be like a day away from coming out or it will have come out on the Switch. So I've only played it on the Wii. I have a lot of issues with Skyward Sword. The motion controls were fine. There's just so many little choices that were made. For instance, the fact that every time you get an item, after you reload your save, you have to go through the laborious process of reading it again. Fi never shuts the hell up. Those things, from what I understand, are being ironed out in the Switch remake, which is great. But there's even deeper problems that I don't think you can really iron out because they're part of the experience. I feel like the pacing of the story slows down at points and gets a little bit difficult to get through, which is a shame because overall, the story arc of Link and Zelda and Groose is great. I love these characters. I don't think there's a Zelda game that has a story arc that compares to Skyward Sword. But that story arc is spread out over so much bloat, so much going back to old areas, so much doing... There are so many things you have to do that just feel like busy work, and it makes it feel like the plot is kind of spinning its wheels a little bit. So it's interesting. It's got one of the best stories, but also one of the worst plots of any Zelda game. And The Imprisoned. I can remember the first time I beat him. I thought, I never want to fight this mother effer again. I had to fight him 2 more times. So, not a fan of that. Not a fan of that at all. But ultimately, there are still great things about Skyward Sword. There are still things I really like about Skyward Sword, namely the story. But ultimately, there's just so many little things in this that annoy me. I do think I like it better than Zelda 2 and Spirit Tracks. I'm trying to decide if it belongs up here in the Master Sword or in the Magical Sword tier. I'm putting that in the Magical Sword tier. I'm sorry. I know that there are a lot of people that like Skyward Sword. I'm just not one of them. I feel that there are a lot of poor choices made in this game that really bring it down for me. And the adventure just doesn't feel as grand, or the adventure isn't as fun to get through as in other Zelda games. Which makes sense, because I'm sure the developers had to spend a great amount of time ironing out the motion controls. Okay, Link Between Worlds. Good golly, that is Golden Master Sword tier all day long. This is the first Zelda game that was a solid 60 frames per second. It looks absolutely beautiful. It takes everything that's great about A Link to the Past and does them again. But it feels different enough to feel good. It also, that's selling it short. It was really set up for Breath of the Wild in that it allowed for a less linear gameplay experience. You could kind of tackle each dungeon whichever order you wanted to go. Kind of sucks because you're renting items or buying items instead of finding them in dungeons, which means that each dungeon still has to be tailored to a specific item because they have to account for you having that item to get into the dungeon. You know, they don't want you getting into a dungeon and then you don't have the items to progress. But still, I think the game gives you a great amount of freedom. It's a fun story, it's a fun Link, it's got some fun characters, it's got a pretty... excuse me, it's got a pretty good plot twist. And a great ending. Zelda Triforce Heroes, boom, waste of 200 rupees. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I got a confession to make, this is the only Zelda game that's ever made me actually tear up. And every time I say that, people are like, at what point did you tear up? And the answer to that is right after I got out of the Shrine of Resurrection, and you walk to that little outcrop, and the piano music kind of builds up, and then the music plays as you look out upon this vast Hyrule. And it made me tear up because it is what the original Legend of Zelda felt like back in the 80s and early 90s. This freedom to go on this adventure in whichever way you wanted to go on it. It was a feeling of magic that genuinely I hadn't felt since playing Ocarina of Time. Because even though that game is more linear than other Zelda games, Ocarina of Time was that first big jump into a new dimension. And Hyrule just felt so filled with possibilities, because yes, there was a time when I didn't know every nook and cranny of that game. But no other Zelda game had made me feel that until I played Breath of the Wild. It's Golden Master Sword tier. Breath of the Wild, I know it doesn't have classic dungeons, and I know that we've kind of reached that point where now it's kind of the cool thing to point out the flaws in Breath of the Wild, and the flaws are there. I mean, you don't have as good a dungeons, the degradation mechanic maybe went a skosh too far, but ultimately, well, and I mean, one of the big ones, sorry, before I move on, one of the big ones, you know, there's not a whole, the side quests aren't very memorable, but it doesn't matter to me because you are this boy facing the world alone and exploring this incredible land alone, and that is what the original Legend of Zelda was. And so I feel like Breath of the Wild really was a breath of fresh air. Made me feel like Zelda was returning to its roots, despite the fact that it was doing things that no other Zelda game had done before it. So that's it, guys. That's my ranking. What do you guys think? Like I said, I'm putting a link in the description, so let me know, at me on Twitter when you do this tier ranking, and let me know. And in the comments, let me know. I'm so sorry, guys. Let me know who your favorite Zelda companion is in the comments, you know, like Navi, Midna, or Fi. The correct answer there, of course, is Toffle. You know, let me know. I'm just kidding, it's actually probably Midna. Maybe. You know, Minish Cap probably actually belongs in the Master Sword tier because